Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar being put on by the Historic Towns Trust in association with the British Association for Local History. In a moment, I shall be introducing you to our speaker this evening, Professor Jackie Eales. Before I do hand over, just need to do a little bit of housekeeping to make the webinar run smoothly. One of the things is that with our webinars that they're slightly different to Zoom talks, Zoom meetings that you might have been on yourselves. With the webinar, you can't actually see yourself on screen, but there is two ways in which you can be involved. One is if you have any trouble with your sound or the vision or that kind of thing, if you would just pop something into the chat, then our backup will deal with it, we hope, successfully. The second thing is about questions and answers. You'll see, I hope, on your screen, at the bottom of your screen, there will be some of an opportunity to put your questions and answers questions into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that as we go along, and putting the questions to Jackie when we actually come to the end of the talk. And we welcome questions. Quite often it's leads things into a very interesting area indeed to actually lead things down. So okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce Jackie, and then hopefully we can get started. So welcome, Jackie. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you and to tell the viewers a little bit about you. And you're the Professor Emeritus at Canterbury Christ Church University, and you are our President of the British Association for Local History, of which I'm a member of the outreach team. So I'm on my best behaviour, we hope. Anyway, for that. Jackie's been living and working in Canterbury for at least 35 years, and a former president of the Historic Association, and has worked extensively on the history of Canterbury, and developed considerable expertise, I think, fair to say, in various aspects of Tudor and Stuart history, local history of Kent, in the Civil Wars, and in Puritanism, and particularly in the lives of women, which I find very interesting, because I think women are particularly neglected still in history, although that is slowly but surely changing. Jackie also told me she's recently been awarded a grant to doing some investigation into French-speaking immigrants in Canterbury, and that'll be mentioned a little bit in the talk as well. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Jackie, and we'll hopefully learn a lot about Canterbury this evening and for the atlas that is being produced towards the end of the year, we hope. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to, in a minute, start my PowerPoint presentation, so I'll have a little pause while I share the screen. But I'm going to be talking about the Historic Towns Trust Atlas for Canterbury, which I'm working on with a small team of colleagues. And we hope that will be finished over the summer and published in time for Christmas. But these things always seem to take longer than you expect. When I first started working on the Atlas, I was told to go and talk to the people who'd done the York Atlas. And I said, well, first of all, how long did it take you to do? And they said, 40 years. So far, it's taken us about 4 or 5. So I think we're ahead of the game. Anyway, I shall share the screen now, and hopefully you'll all see the PowerPoint. So I hope that's visible, David. Good. So, investigating Canterbury's past for the new Historic Towns Trust Atlas. So let's move on. I'm having trouble moving on with my screen. Is there some trick to this, David, that I'm missing? There we are. So what I wanted to talk to you about this evening was how it all started. I said it started about 4 or 5 years ago. What needs to be done? What is the format of one of these atlases? And in our case, we're researching 2,000 years of Canterbury's history going back to the Roman period. And we're looking at what survives, but we're also looking at what is lost, which is quite significant. And this is one of the things that I've learned a great deal about, that there is so much under our feet as we walk across the city that we don't know about, that we have some archaeological digs that will inform us about, but we're not really aware of it as we're walking around. And I've become much more aware because of the archaeologists I'm working with. I've also been taught to look up at buildings as well, not just walk down the street looking at the shop fronts and window shopping, but actually look up and look at the skyline, which is fascinating in Canterbury because so many medieval buildings, or the core of medieval buildings, have survived. So what survives, what is lost, and also new understandings. I'm talking about new understandings very much from my own point of view, but I hope that there are also new understandings for other people as well. So how did it all begin? It all began with a pilot project, which was the historical map of Canterbury, which came out in 2020. And it was a partnership between my university, Canterbury Christ Church University, Canterbury Archaeological Trust, who really are the guardians of all the knowledge about Canterbury and its excavations that have happened over the last 40 to 50 years. And they've got a lot of information that hasn't really been put in the public domain. There's a lot of what they call grey literature, which is reports that hasn't been published yet. So we're able to delve into their archive. We're able to talk to people who've been digging up Canterbury with their bare hands for decades, and they're very knowledgeable, and it's great fun working with them. But in particular, Jake Weeks at Canterbury Archaeological Trust had the idea of getting in touch with the Historic Towns Trust and doing an atlas. But luckily, we were diverted into doing the map first, because that really got us off to a flying start with some cartography, with an outline for a gazetteer. I'll come to all this in a minute. So we've got the wonderful map, which we've been selling for a number of years. And if people want to buy that, it's still on sale at the HTT website in their new shop, so you can buy that. So it's partnership between the Historic Towns Trust as the publishers and offering us cartographical expertise, the Archaeological Trust with the knowledge, and myself as the historian and working with other colleagues as well. So that was a huge success as far as we're concerned as a team, but also as far as Canterbury is concerned as well. And it gave us a route map to do the atlas. So for the atlas, what needs to be done? Well, first of all, it is very much teamwork. You cannot do one of these atlases on your own. You can't even do the map on your own, in my view. And the first thing you need is funding. And funding has been a sort of movable feast, because we originally budgeted for about £30,000 of funding, but we've gone way beyond that. And we've been very, very lucky with our sponsors. The HTT have been able to provide sponsorship in a way, covering publication costs and some of the cartography. But we also look to local sponsors. And I think this is it's a kind of object lesson in how to approach local societies. So I particularly want to thank my university, Canterbury Christ Church University, because I was talking to the Vice Chancellor, and I was saying that we needed some funding and could we get some seed funding, and he did give us some seed funding, which unlocked other funding. So it's quite important to start off by getting some seed funding. And then other local societies also helped. The Historical Association, for example, which is very strong in Canterbury, very strong local branch, but also the Martello Trust, the Oldham Trust, Canterbury Commemoration Society, the Canterbury Society, and so on. And we're really very, very grateful to all of those sponsors who've helped. Now, this is a new format atlas as well. The Historic Towns Trust have been publishing atlases for several decades, and they had a format which involved having a separate foldable maps in a pocket at the back of the atlas. And it was quite a hefty tome in hardback. But we're going for something a little bit more like a soft cover. The maps will be integral to the actual binding. So we're doing something slightly different. And we're also having a slightly shorter introduction, but it's got longer as we've been writing it, of course. And then we've got a gazetteer as well of the most important buildings and streets as well. So that's like a kind of A to Z of all these streets, buildings, and a little potted history of each one. Now, the maps are very important. I've said that this is teamwork and that we are working with Giles Darks at the HTT, their cartographer, and he's been zooming along with the maps. He's really been producing the maps faster than we can think about what should be on them. So we've had some very interesting conversations about whether things are accurate. They've got to be accurate, whether we've represented what we want. They're period maps. So there'll be a map, for example, from the Roman period. There'll be a map of Canterbury just before the Reformation. There'll be a map from about 1640, and then going up to the Ordnance Survey map of 1907 is the last sort of information that we're including. And some people ask me, why are you stopping at the beginning of the 20th century? And the reason for that is that you'd have to double the size of the atlas if you went for the 20th century as well, because so much has changed, been a great deal of change, which I'll be talking about. So in terms of teamwork, we're still working with the Archaeological Trust on this. My university is supporting it. And we're also working with Clive Bowley, an architect who used to be the City Council Buildings Conservation Officer. And he has an immense amount of knowledge about individual buildings, listed buildings in particular in Canterbury, and can tell you a great deal about surveys of those buildings, where you can find reports about them and so on. And so that's part of the work we have to do. But of course, we're preparing for publication as well. There's all the usual sort of copy editing, checking, and there'll be indexing and so on. And one of the team members who's really been invaluable in doing all of this drafting of the gazetteer in particular, and who will be helping with the preparation for publication, is Luke Farrell, a PhD student who studied at Canterbury Christ Church University as an undergraduate and is now at Kent University doing a PhD. So that's kind of outline of the team that we've put together and how we're going to write and prepare the atlas for publication. Now, I mentioned streets. There are about 400 streets that have to go into the gazetteer, and streets have become the bane of my life, because I really want to know when they were first given their name, when they were first built up, and it's not always possible to find out. But let me show you one example of a street. This is now called St. George's Lane, and it's near St. George's Church. I'll show you an image of St. George's Church later. And this lane has existed in this location since about the late 12th century. And we know that because William Urry wrote a wonderful book called Canterbury Under the Angevins, which came out, I think, in about 1970 or 1963 or 4. And at the back of his book, he's got a portfolio of maps as well. He's mapped all of the rentals, the land rentals, that were held by the cathedral at the time, the priory, Christchurch Priory. And so we know the plot of land in some cases. We know the name of the person who was leasing the land and so on. It's an absolutely magnificent piece of work. And he drew all of the maps by hand, trying to work out the plot that the lease refers to. So we've got that for 1166. But this lane has changed its name from Sheepshank Lane in 1611 on a map by Speed. By 1752, it was labelled as Sheepshank Lane, slightly different, so we're still recording it. And then later in the 18th century, it becomes known as St. George's Lane. Well, you'd never guess it was called Sheepshank Lane unless somebody did some research and told you, but it gives you more of a feel for Canterbury in the past, when it was more of a centre, but with a very rural agricultural hinterland. So relying on Canterbury Archaeological Trust, we've got some marvellous reconstructions of Canterbury in the past, which will be reflected in the cartography. So here we've got Romano-British Canterbury, and it was a really important centre. You can see some of the key buildings here. You can see the temple area, the small building at the back to the top of the picture, and in front of that, the forum. And to the left, you've got the amphitheatre, the theatre. And then just down in the lower right corner of the reconstruction, those strange things that look like Nissen huts are actually the public baths. So that gives you an idea of what Canterbury looked like, very built up, very urbanized in this particular period. And that's the map that Giles Darks has produced for us to reflect that series of buildings. And you can see where the baths are, the theatre, the temple, the forum. But also, of course, we're able to include all the information that the Archaeological Trust has come up with about where there are cemeteries. Down in the lower right-hand corner of the map, there seems to have been a shrine. The main roads to London, top left, off to Richborough, another very important Roman fort, and so on. So we're getting much more of a feel for Roman Canterbury from the Trust's excavations, but also from Giles's cartography, which is absolutely central to the atlas. So thank you, Giles. Now, suddenly, 300 years later, in AD 600, Canterbury is taking on a rather different air. Again, this is a reconstruction. It's still a thriving centre, but it's very different from the Roman period, with, I guess, all of those Roman buildings becoming ruins, just like at the dissolution, at the Reformation, all of the ecclesiastical institutions in Canterbury being ruined, stones being robbed out, or sites being built anew. So we've got that. There's a bit of a gap, I think, coming up, because I couldn't find any reconstructions by Canterbury Archaeological Trust. So I had to turn to York University, and this is Canterbury in 1450. And there's been a lot of development, obviously, in the previous 800 years. But in this reconstruction, you can see quite clearly those ecclesiastical institutions, the cathedral at the top of the plan. Down to the left of the cathedral, you've got the Blackfriars. Just immediately below, to the bottom of the map, you've got or reconstruction, you've got the Greyfriars. Coming round in a circle, following the city walls, you've got the castle on the far right, and then going back up to the top again, you've got the Austin monks or friars, friary, who are often called the White Friars in Canterbury, but they're not actually Cistercians. So all of those huge ecclesiastical institutions are really dominating the scene. And of course, you've got pilgrimage coming to Canterbury in this period with Becket's Shrine. And you've got a lot of pilgrim inns that we've been looking at, and we'll look at some of those in a minute. So it's a really important site. But off to the left, you can see that road off to the left, just by the Stour, is the road from London, and you can see the Westgate Towers there. And then the High Street leading up to the Whitefriars site at the other end of town. And still a lot of open space. This is something that is interesting the City Council, that there's a lot of open green space in the city. And in dialogue with the City Council, there's been a renewal of some of the green spaces in Canterbury as a result of talking about this historical importance of green lungs in cities, just like London has green lungs, Regent's Park and so on. Other cities like Canterbury have also got them, and the City Council is now taking a great deal of interest in them and in their history. Now, moving into the 16th century, we start to get really nice maps of Canterbury as well, which make life a lot easier, working out how streets develop, how people viewed the town at the time as well. Now, these are maps by people who are not native to Canterbury. They didn't live there. William Smith, for example, produced a whole series of maps of towns, London, Rochester and Kent, Canterbury and so on. And his map on the left from the Armada year, 1588, is actually quite inaccurate. There are things that are wrong with it. So I won't dwell on it too much, but it does give you an idea of the circuit of the city walls. That's always very important in these maps, because these city walls, although they've been built up and rebuilt, they are on the foundations of the original Roman fortifications. So they follow that line. And again, it's the archaeologists who know this, and we can thank for this information. But it does contain the city in this period. Brown and Hogenberg on the right here, very famous cartographers who produced all sorts of European atlases as well. And they must have got somebody local to help them with the knowledge, or perhaps one of them came here. But they obviously produced a very much more accurate map than Smith did in some ways. But again, very beautifully produced and coloured and so on. So we've got those to rely on. Now, David mentioned earlier that 16th and 17th century Canterbury attracted a very large French-speaking immigrant population. They came from Flanders, they came from the Spanish Netherlands, basically, the southern Spanish Netherlands, but also from around the Pas-de-Calais. And histories of Canterbury quite often don't give them full credit, because they first came to Canterbury in 1575. A group of 100 families moved in. And they moved in because Canterbury had really gone into economic decline because of the Reformation. And the pilgrim trade had dried up. People weren't coming as often from the continent or from the rest of the country. There was still trade, but there were empty houses. These 100 families were given empty houses to move into that were owned by the city council. So obviously this was a great boost to the economy. There were strict limitations on the sort of trade that they could follow. Most of them were weavers, but obviously they actually had their own bakers, doctors, and so on, and their own minister. And this is one of the ministers who served in Canterbury in the 18th century. Their French church moved into the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral in about 1576, and it's been there ever since, continually. There's still a French congregation, French-speaking congregation, that meet in the crypt regularly, and they've got a full list of all of their pastors during that period. So one of the things I want to do with the Atlas is to bring that community to the fore. And mostly that first tranche of visitors, immigrants, were weavers. And they moved on from weaving wool to weaving very fine silk. And Canterbury silk became very famous into the 17th and 18th centuries. It had its ups and downs. It was in decline at one point, but went on the up in the late 18th century, and was being used in the royal court. Some of the weavers from Canterbury went up to London, became master weavers there as well. So it's a very important part of the story, I think, this French community. And moving into the 17th century, we've got Speed's map from 1611, which uses the name Sheepshank Lane for St George's Lane. And again, that's fairly accurate. Again, Speed is not a native. But on the right, we've got this amazing hand-drawn, hand-coloured map from about 1640. And this is vast, and it was produced by somebody locally who knew Canterbury very, very well. This is in the cathedral archives, and it's one of the great glories of the city's history. We don't know why it was produced. I suspect it was produced for a court case called a quo warranto, which took place between the city and the cathedral in the 1620s. It may have started earlier, but it was certainly going strong in the 1620s. And it's really about who has jurisdiction over what land inside the city. And in particular, at the Reformation, the jurisdiction of those great institutions, the monasteries, friaries, etc., didn't lapse. It went with the ownership of the land, and that created certain conflicts. So the church is still cathedral is still claiming to have some of those liberties. And the city council is saying, no, we're in charge of this area and you should be paying tax to us. And that's what it's all about. It's about taxation. But this map is about 7 foot by 9 foot. It weighs a ton. It has to be handled very carefully because it's very fragile, very rarely taken out of the cupboard it's kept in. And when it's taken out, it requires two archivists to carry it. It's so heavy, and to unroll it. So I've never seen the original. I've only seen images of it. But I'm going to show you a couple of extracts from it to show you the kind of magical detail that you get. On the left, you've got the cathedral. And again, you've got all this wonderful open land. You've got orchards, gardens in Canterbury in the 1640s. They're incredibly important. And the different coloured land, I think, relates to those liberties or jurisdictions that we were thinking about earlier. Scant, who was the most fashionable gardener you could possibly get in the period. I understand my internet connection is unstable. Are people having a lot of trouble hearing me? Or is it just momentary?
It went out for a few seconds, Jackie.
Okay.
But
so I was talking about John Tredescant being the most fashionable gardener you could get. And here he is working in Canterbury, introducing specialist plants that he's imported, perhaps. We know he imported plants from Virginia, but also Russia. So there must have been exotic plants in this garden, and it's beautifully represented in this map. On the right, we've got what is basically part of the High Street today. And right in the middle, where it says St. George's, just to the left of that, you've got a row of buildings that were demolished in the 18th century because they were a hindrance to coaches going through the town. So they widened the road and they got rid of, on the left, they got rid of a church, St. Andrew's Church. In the middle, they got rid of a water conduit. There was this vast source of clean water in Canterbury from the springs above the city that was being pumped down to the city, and people could take it for washing and drinking and so on. Just to the right of that is the meat shambles where the butchers sold their meat. So you've got this marvellous representation of the city in a certain point of time. And moving on, maps, from the 18th century begin to look more like modern maps. They're not quite as representational as the earlier maps we looked at. This is a very highly accurate map, and we've been using this to look at the changes of names of streets and the disposition of buildings and so on. Now, in Canterbury, we're very lucky in that we've got 3 historians who really recorded what was going on between 1640 and 1800. On the left, we've got William Sumner, who wrote a book about the antiquities of Canterbury, going right back to the Roman period. And he's talking about excavations taking place in Canterbury in the 17th century and digging out Roman remains. So this has been going on a long time. We've got William Gosling in the middle, who did a wonderful book about walks about Canterbury, which came out in 1774, the first edition. And he's talking about buildings that were recently demolished in his lifetime. So we've got very precise dating for the removal of things like the church I just showed you, or the water conduit from his work. Finally, on the right, we've got Edward Hasted. And Hasted wrote a magnificent 12-volume history of Kent. 2 volumes of that are devoted to Canterbury. So again, we've got wonderful contemporary historians bringing the story up to date, but talking about the past as well. So this is Gosling. He's actually talking about that middle row of buildings that I just showed you that have been demolished. So this is from the 2nd edition of his book, and he's talking about the conduit, which was pulled down in 1754, and St. Andrew's Church in 1763. So very precise dating, wonderful, accurate information from someone who was observing Canterbury at the time. And this is Hasted. He's talking about a house in St. Martin's Parish, a good gentleman's house. And he goes back to when it was first recorded in 1634 and says who owns it now. He gives, for so many houses in Canterbury, like this gentleman's houses, he gives a complete rundown of all of the owners over 100 and 150 years. And that's the building he's talking about now, St. Martin's Priory, which is part of Canterbury Christ Church University. And we know from excavations or a survey, building survey by the Archaeological Trust, that the core of the building is probably early 16th century. But as you can see from this facade, it was Georgianized, made to look like a Georgian house in Hasted's day. So we know who did that. We know who the owners were and who lived there throughout, which is lovely. So we've got a lovely potted history of the Priory building. So the atlas is looking at what survives. The UNESCO World Heritage Site, Canterbury is a World Heritage Site. That consists of the cathedral, St. Augustine's Abbey, and St. Martin's Church. Part of the site are on land owned or managed by the King's School or my university and by the City Council. So there are quite a lot of partners involved in that World Heritage management of the site. The West Gate, which I pointed out on an earlier reconstruction, the Norman Castle on the reconstruction as well. So those are some of the really important buildings that survive, partially in ruins, of course, in Canterbury. So that's the cathedral, built over many hundreds of years. And in fact, Paul Bennett, who used to direct the Archaeological Trust, told me there are 4 different cathedrals here, going from the Anglo-Saxon period up to the late medieval period, when it was still being rebuilt, bits of it. And of course, there's been buildings since. This is St. Augustine's Abbey, very much a ruin now. The wall there is part of Henry VIII's palace, which was built after the Reformation, and the land came to the Crown. And this is the site of the Tredescant Garden. Just beyond that, the gardens were laid out, and they were described in 1630 as being absolutely magnificent. This is St. Martin's Church, of course, which has the reputation of being the site of the longest used parish church in England, that it's got a continuous history from the late 16th century with the Augustine mission to Canterbury to convert local people, Ethelbert, Bertha, King and Queen, to Christianity. And of course, that's a 12th century building that's been built up as well over time. But I'm very fond of that because it was opposite my office for many years and I could see it from my office window. There's the Norman Castle, again in a rather dilapidated state, unfortunately, but work is going on. You can see on the right the scaffolding. Work is going on to conserve and preserve the building and reopen it to the public. It's been closed for over a decade, I believe, but it will be reopened after the work has been done. And again, this is part of the initiative of the City Council to revive the history and the buildings in Canterbury that have been neglected. Westgate Towers, built in the 1380s, part of the fortifications of the city, the walls, and the only city gate to survive, unfortunately. The others were all demolished in the 18th century to widen the roads. That's the usual story. And that one was nearly demolished as well, but luckily it was saved. And the traffic is now one way through the towers and the other way around the side of the tower. Now I want to look at something that's disappeared. One of Chaucer's pilgrim inns. Chaucer's pilgrims were going to Canterbury, and the story is they were going to go and stay in the Chequers Inn, which was one of the really vast pilgrim inns built by the cathedral, by the priory, Christchurch Priory clerics, to house the pilgrims coming to Becket Shrine. And it's always called the Chequers of the Hope. If you look at a tourist book or a guidebook, it will say the Chequers of the Hope. And yet local people did not call it that. They just called it the Chequer. And that name came around not because Chaucer named it the Chequers of the Hope, but because after he died, an anonymous author who seems to have been from Canterbury, may have been a monk, finished the Canterbury Tales for Chaucer, brought the pilgrims to Canterbury and put them up in this particular inn, which was well known to people locally and to pilgrims. But also he called it the Chequers of the Hope. And I haven't found any contemporary documents when the building was built in the late 14th century into the 15th century, when it was being used as a pilgrim inn, subsequently when it was used by the city council for meetings, when the pilgrim trade had dried up. I can find no reference to the Chequers of the Hope, just the Chequer. And I've got a real bee in my bonnet. I want to try and make people realize that the Chequers of the Hope is not a Chaucerian name and it's not a contemporary name. I may fail in this quest, but I want people to know about it. Now, unfortunately, that building you can see there with Grafton House on it, it was a very big of it burnt down in 1865, unfortunately. So we've only got remnants of that left now, along with bombing as well. This is a reconstruction, again, by Canterbury Archaeological Trust of that Chequer Inn. It's the building to your left, which has got the courtyard in the middle. And if you look to the route going past that inn up to the top right of the reconstruction, you'll see the Christchurch gate going into the cathedral. So it's right on top of the cathedral. You could go, you could have your breakfast and go in and see Becket's Shrine and come out with a miracle cure if you were lucky. So other buildings, there are lots of timber framed buildings in Canterbury, large number. Some of them are hidden. They've been Georgianized, as I said earlier. Here's one, the Full Staff Hotel, where you can see that a lot of the original building is there, but even so, it's been altered over the years. It's got a date on it which says 1403. In the past, it's had a date on it that said 1405. So when it was built is unknown. I'm on another quest to see if I can find the real date. Canterbury Archaeological Trust think that it's a later building. It's not early 15th century. It might be late 15th century. So again, we're going to see if we can find out a date for that. This is a very famous house. It's sometimes called the Crooked House or Sir John Boy's house. It's meant to have the date of 1617 on it, but you can't see it from the ground anymore. Apparently there's a photograph of that somewhere in the Archaeological Trust, and I'm going to try and get hold of that, winkle it out. But some people at the Trust say it says 1647. So which date it is a bit of a conundrum, and I'm trying to find out if I can find any wills that mention the house, mention leaving it. But it is very iconic because of the immense slant on the building, because I think in the 19th century there was some work done on it, and the central chimney stack collapsed, causing this kind of slant. Now, I've put this in here because I've got another bee in my bonnet about this, because this is the ducking stool in the High Street over the Stour. And again, I turned to the Archaeological Trust and said, well, how authentic is that? And they said, no, it's a hoist for moving goods from a barge into a shop or onto dry land, and somebody's just cobbled together an old chair and put it on it. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a ducking stool in Canterbury. There certainly was, but it wasn't fixed. It was mobile. It was moved from house to house, often as a warning. It wasn't used to duck somebody for scolding or whatever, but it was placed outside their house for a number of hours as a ritual form of humiliation. But of course, the original does not survive. Moving on into the 18th century, this is Westgate House in St Dunstan's, and it's one of the best examples of a Georgian house in the city. And it's actually got the date it was built on it, on the rain hoppers, on those white lead rain hoppers. It says 1760. And turning to the cathedral archives, I was able to reconstruct the ownership of this house from 1760 through to the present day, because there was a complete set of deeds that had been left with the cathedral archives by the local solicitors, Furley Page. So that was an absolute coup, being able to establish the family that lived there, the family of a brewer called William Allen, right through to its use as commercial premises today. This Guildhall had a medieval core going back to the 12th century. There's undercroft. There's an undercroft still in existence, but again it was Georgianized in the 18th century, and then demolished in the 1950s as a result of war bombing, which I'll come to in a minute. It was deemed unsafe, so it was demolished and disappeared. But again, we've got a wonderful description of this building in its heyday from Gosling. So we know the layout of the inside of the building and how it was used for courts and for concerts as well. And Mozart played there when he was a young child. We've lost a lot of other buildings as well. This is a Presbyterian church built by John Green Hall in the Gothic Revival style, which was knocked down for the Ring Road in the 1960s. So that's disappeared. Other buildings went with it. And it's a magnificent building. John Green Hall had an immense influence on Canterbury's architecture, and using this Gothic Revival style, which is underestimated. I think people locally don't fully appreciate his contribution. And again, the Atlas, I hope, will make that clearer. This is the cemetery chapel that he designed just outside Canterbury's city walls. And he also designed a number of buildings inside the city, including the Lloyd's Bank. This still stands, and you can see the Gothic style, Gothic Revival style there very clearly. Very distinctive style that he used. Another Gothic Revival architect who hasn't been fully acknowledged in Canterbury is Samuel Sanders Toulon. And this book by his, I don't know whether it's a direct descendant, but it's certainly a relative, called Alan Toulon, gives us the best account of the work that he did. He built a lot of churches across the country. He was very well known. But there are some buildings in Canterbury that he designed which have been overlooked. They're not in the book, and people locally don't know about his contribution. But looking at 19th century newspapers, we discovered that he designed the Abbots Barton Hotel, which is a building from about 1860. And you can see that remarkable Gothic Revival style at work there, can't you, with those spires and turrets? Absolutely remarkable. Just ignore the 1930s extension or whatever it is to the side, which is not very beautiful. This is another Toulon house, Luxmore House in the New Dover Road, which was a road that was set out, Turnpike Road, in the late 18th century. This is another Gothic Revival church that was built in 1828. We're not sure who the architect was. We haven't been able to find that out, but that was demolished in the 1930s. And that was in the High Street, so a very prominent site, which is now empty and has got a small garden where the cemetery was behind it. Now, I was talking about destruction, but of course the real destruction came in the 1940s, 1942, with the Baedeker raids. This is the continuation of the High Street. And you can just see a clock in the middle there at the top of the photograph. And that tower to the left of it is all that remains of St. George's Church, which I mentioned earlier when we were looking at Sheepshank Lane. St. George's Lane runs beyond that. And again, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this, because this was the church where Christopher Marlowe was baptized, and it's been more or less trashed by the bombing. But look at the other destruction as well. That's the tower today. You can see the clock, or a clock, perhaps a replacement clock. And this is, and again, we're grateful to Giles Darks for this, because this is a plan of the high explosive bombs that fell on Canterbury in 1942 during that Baedeker raid. And you can see the distribution of the bombing is quite extensive, even near the cathedral, certainly down along the right-hand side of the plan, there's a concentration. So a lot of buildings were lost then. And as I said, with the Guildhall, it took a while before those hard decisions were made to actually demolish some of those buildings. Now, I said earlier that we're stopping with the old Ordnance Survey map from 1906-7 for obvious reasons, that any further and it would be vast. Now, finally, if you want any further information about the Atlas series and you want to go to the shop, you can go to their website. That's the address. And it says, including free access to early volumes. So the earlier volumes, which have been in print for a while, you can have a look at there. I should have included at this point a slide about donations, but I had trouble dropping it into my PowerPoint. So I'm sure if you go to the site, you can find out how to make a donation to the Historic Towns Trust, should you want to help their work. If for any reason you want to donate directly to the Canterbury Atlas, I'm sure you can specify that as well. And even if the information is not there on the website, you can certainly email them and find out how to make a donation. So I'd like to stop there because we're coming up to just past 1:45, and there may be some questions, of course.
Excellent, Jackie. Thank you very much indeed. That's fascinating. I've been noting away like fury in the as you've gone along, which I do that anyway. I've done it. Okay, we have had one or two questions already, which I'll just put to you that have come. One is, and I was fascinated to hear about the weavers in particular. One of them was, any ideas where the source of their silk came from?
Yes, they imported it. When the silk industry really took off in Canterbury, it was because of Huguenots, French weavers coming from places like Lyon. And they were used to importing silk from Italy in particular, and also using local French silk. So they carried on doing that. There isn't any local silk production in Canterbury, unfortunately, although there is a mulberry tree, but I don't think it's producing enough silk for the silkworms. Sorry, enough mulberries for the silkworms.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think that's the kind of influence on trade, and they brought the skills in particular as well. And is there any kind of surviving evidence of the weavers, for example, in some places in the buildings you get kind of surviving evidence?
Clive Bowley is convinced that any house that has got a row of windows that's been built on top of a medieval house and projects out is actually a weaving loft. It's got a weaving loft in it and it's got a lot of light coming in. I suspect some people would challenge that because there's no documentary evidence necessarily. But we do know some houses. There's a house called the Old Weavers on the King's Bridge. And it became called the Weavers actually only in the 20th century when a weaving school was set up there. But archaeological excavations did reveal evidence of weaving having taken place there as well, things like bobbins and so on. But also we've got inventories which mention looms. And we know that often people did piecework and they would have one loom in their house and work producing either wool, cloth, or silk cloth. So we've got some documentary evidence of the trade as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Oh, that's excellent. It's very interesting to hear about that. Jumping a little bit now, another question is about the Augustinian mission to Ethelbert. Could you say a little bit more about that? And,
that's 597. It's when the Pope Gregory sends St. Augustine to Canterbury at the invitation of Ethelbert, King of Kent, and his queen, Bertha. Now, Bertha is from France, and she's already Christian. The Franks, she's one of the Franks, have converted to Christianity, and she's quite keen to convert her husband and then the local population. And that's when St. Martin's Church, the original St. Martin's Church, only little bits of it are left, would have started to have been used in the sort of, early Christian conversion period. So St. Augustine comes over, founds St. Augustine's Abbey, brings books with him. We know that he brought a lot of books to help convert the local population. And there are actually line drawings of that little library, a later medieval illustration of the little library that he brought with him.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting period, isn't it? Without a doubt, that's kind of movements there. Question about how dramatic was the impact of the dissolution on the fabric of Coventry? Oh, Canterbury.
Canterbury.
Wrong city.
Well, this is very interesting because all of those ecclesiastical institutions, the Black Friars, the Grey Friars, the White Friars, were leased by the Crown, who had seized the land, to the laity. And they were built up, in many cases, gentlemen leased them and built their own mansions. So we know that there was a mansion at the Blackfriars. We know at the Blackfriars there were other tenants living there in houses, and the big refectory and the guest house were used. The guest house in particular was used by the Walloons and the Flemings and the Huguenots as their market hall. That's where they took their cloth to be sealed up. So the cloth was examined and it was measured, make sure it's the right length, and then baled up and sealed to give it justification, give it the authority to be sold at that length, that weight, and that quality. So that's the Blackfriars, but the same story at the Greyfriars, the Lovelace family. Some of you are familiar with Richard Lovelace's poetry from the Civil War period. His family owned the Greyfriars and then the Whitefriars as well. In fact, the mansion there in the early 19th century was owned by somebody who had adopted Jane Austen's brother, Edward, and Jane Austen visited them at the mansion. So the whole ecclesiastical building has just disappeared and became secularized.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting, isn't it? How that change, those kind of changes. And you'll presumably they'll be able to shown on the map that kind of
yes,
how that'll actually be shown on the map. We've had one question which I'm not sure you'll be able to give us much. You won't certainly be able to answer it immediately. I don't expect anyway, although you might surprise me. But about the actual size of the atlas.
Yes, I have been told about this. How many pages? It's just going to be just over 100 pages, I think. It's not going to be a vast tome. The Gazetteer is about 35,000 words. The introduction is about 15,000 words. And if Giles Darks is listening, he might be able to actually tell us the exact number of pages we were looking at quite recently. Here we are. Vanessa Harding's told us that this will be flexi-bound. And the size, 243 by 333 millimeters. And my memory is something like 100 to 128 pages.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, it's going to be quite a substantial work then, isn't it? I mean, is this the first of the new format?
Yes, it's the first of the new ones. But, I mean, if you think about the York one taking 40 years to do, had a lot of scholarship in it. So we're trying to distill a lot of knowledge by Canterbury Archaeological Trust in particular into the atlas.
And what I found interesting as well is about the one of the architects about the Gothic revival churches as well. Very something I didn't really know about, I must admit. Or why should I? I wondered if you could say just a little bit more about them as well.
Yes, I'd be delighted because I think that's one of the things I want to bring out. When we think about the Gothic revival in Canterbury, people always use as the example the Missionary College, which was built on the site of the Royal Palace that Henry VIII built. And the buildings there were taken over in the mid-19th century by a man called Beresford Hope. And he had the Missionary College built in the Gothic revival style. So that's the prime example that everybody cites. And yet there are all these other buildings that were designed by quite important local architects, but we don't know a lot about them. I couldn't find a portrait of John Green Hall, for example, and yet he designed the cemetery. He built that chapel. He built enormous buildings up the high street, the banks. He built, he had an office in St. Margaret Street. He was very much an important figure, and yet so under known in Canterbury. And the same with Samuel Toulon, because it was totally unclear that he had any contact with Canterbury. And yet somebody suggested it to me. And I thought, well, how do I prove this? And then lo and behold, it was actually the archivist at the King's School, Peter Henderson, collects all the information he can about buildings with connections to the King's School. And Luxmore House had a connection. And he'd collected newspaper clippings, and there was a newspaper clipping of the sale of the house in the 19th century saying, "This magnificent gentleman's house designed by Samuel Toulon. You want to buy it." You'll be queuing to buy it.
I like that. Would you like to buy it? Yes, very interesting.
Want to.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. One other question about the impact of the dissolution of the monasteries on the built fabric of Canterbury.
Yes, what was the question?
And how dramatic was it?
How dramatic?
Yeah.
Well, apart from the 3 or 4 big priories and friaries, St. Augustine's Abbey, of course, was the other one, because the Crown took over the land and Henry VIII built this palace. And of course, in order to do that, they had to rob out the buildings, the ecclesiastical buildings. So immediately you get gentry mansion houses being built on these sites, the palace being built. They require quite a lot of material, bricks, tiles, and so on. And the ecclesiastical buildings are just sort of reduced in height. Bits of them survive. There's something called St. Ethelbert's Tower in the St. Augustine's monastery site. And that survives to the 18th century, and then an earthquake knocks it down, of all things. You wouldn't expect that. So the other thing, of course, is that I mentioned that there are 100, well, not 100, but there are empty properties in Canterbury for 100 families. So I imagine some of those houses would have been multiple occupation in 1575 for the French-speaking immigrants. So those houses must have been pretty sort of run down by this stage. And that's because of the Reformation. We tend not to think of housing, secular buildings looking grim because of the Reformation. But I think in Canterbury, it probably did look a bit grim.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Excellent. I think, well, we've been through the questions. I mean, I was fascinated by the beads in your bonnet. Do you have lots of those?
Yes.
I think it's very honest to say something like that. I mean, I have them, I'm sure, but I don't know if I'd admit to some of them. Certainly,
really,
it's one of those kinds of things that it's people look at you and they shake their heads and that kind of thing. I think, well, we're almost 8 o'clock, so I think I should wind things up unless anyone has got to like to put another quick one in the question and answer.
I was going to say this is
Giles. Sorry. No, you first.
I was going to say this has been recorded, hasn't it?
It has, yes.
Because I'd like to apologise if anybody did miss some of it. I see somebody missed quite a big chunk of it. So it is going to be recorded, and it should be available in a better format if it's been recorded than some of you received on your iPads and computers.
Yeah. Giles has just put in the chat about the loss of pilgrims to St. Thomas Becket's tomb. Thomas Becket's tomb and a big drop in income for Canterbury.
That's right.
I think you mentioned that kind of that kind of impact and thing. And I think also that I decided the Chaucer bit I didn't know about at all, that Chaucer didn't actually finish the tales.
No.
My ignorance is becoming more and more exposed as we go on.
Yeah.
Jackie, I'd like to bring it to a close. Thank you very, very much for what this presentation has been. Excellent. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone has found it fascinating and very, very interesting. And we look forward indeed to seeing the atlas published in 2026.
Thank you.
Maybe
Thank
early
you very much.
2000s.